Right, so we're going to go on to our next speakers. They are Ruth Dineen and Nataly Anderson. And Ruth is the international coordinator of the Hague Mothers campaign. And Nataly is a Hague Mother activist, founder of Family Court Crisis, and a member of the Hague Mothers UK project team. And the title of their talk today is Hague Mothers, Ending the Injustices of the Hague Abduction Convention. So thank you so much, Ruth and Nataly, and over to you.
We're going to talk about the Hague Abduction Convention, which is an international treaty which has been signed by over 100 countries worldwide, but it's now being used to control and abuse mothers and children worldwide. So what we're going to do, we're going to show a short video which explains the problem. Then Nataly will talk about the on-the-ground reality for mothers and children. And then I'll talk a little bit about the campaign we've got going to try and end these injustices. And I'm going to ask you for your help right here and now.
The 1980 Hague Convention on International Parental Child Abduction was designed to ensure the swift and safe return of children who are taken across international borders by one parent without the other parent's permission. It's usually very effective, but there's a problem. The convention was originally designed to deal with fathers who abduct children and to protect mothers and children, but that's changed. Now, in over 75% of cases, the abducting parent is the mother. Many of them are fleeing domestic abuse.
There's nothing that actually protects a fleeing mother and child. No local justice, no international justice, nothing.
The convention forces children, and therefore mothers, to return to the country they have fled. Leaving an abuser is terrifying, fleeing across borders doubly so. Mothers are leaving their homes, their jobs, their friends. They're traumatized and often in fear of their lives. They try to flee to safety, and then the Hague Convention hits them.
Being in court was so terrifying, so stressful that it has left me traumatised. And then they sent my sons back to the man who was beating me, raping me.
Hague mothers are rarely entitled to legal aid. There are not many specialist lawyers available, and they only have a few weeks and sometimes only a few days to prepare their case. The only defence available to them is Article 13b of the Convention. The court does not have to order the return of a child if the mother can prove that there is a grave risk that returning them would expose them to physical or psychological harm or place them in an intolerable situation. But grave risk is interpreted very narrowly. Domestic abuse against the mother is rarely seen as a grave risk or intolerable situation for the child, in spite of extensive evidence to the contrary. Children are almost always returned to the country and often into the care of the abusive parent.
My ex has filed a hate convention case against us after we fled Ireland last year. I just know they're going to send my kids back and then I'll have to follow. But what happens to us when we get there? What if he kills us?
Mothers must choose whether to return with their children or send them back alone. Those who do return face post-separation abuse, destitution, homelessness, isolation, and sometimes even criminal proceedings. They often have no family and no support networks, a textbook context for continued abuse.
It is not in any child's best interest to grow up with a mother who is isolated or unemployed and depressed, trapped in a foreign country by an abusive ex-partner. There has never been a single day when I have felt safe or felt that my children were safe here.
We, Hague Mothers, aim to end this injustice with the help of international support from lawyers, domestic violence professionals, academics, women's groups, human rights activists, child psychologists, the Hague Mothers themselves, and the general public. We call on the Hague Secretariat to recognise the grave risk and intolerable situation caused by exposure to domestic abuse. Where domestic abuse is alleged, we ask for the following amendment to the Convention. Legal aid for mothers, a rebuttable presumption of no return. Welfare hearings held in a safe location. The views and wishes of the child to be fully considered. And a restriction on the use of protective measures to defeat Article 13B. We are the Hague Mothers. We're an unstoppable global movement for justice.
So yeah, I would like to introduce you to some real Hague Mothers. Many of these women are silenced by the secrecy of the family courts. They could be imprisoned if they speak out, which could happen to me too, actually. So this is Sarah Marie. She sought asylum with her sons in Canada because their father had tried to kill her and beat them. They were not protected by the family courts in the USA. They were not protected by Canada either. Sarah Marie was arrested with a gun to her head. She was charged in the US with felonies for abduction. She has not seen her children for 3.5 years. This is Jan Ford. She's the author of a book called The Loving Abductor. She was sent back to France from the UK to the man who had abused her. The French police told her that she and her son were not safe in France. And so she was forced to go on the run. UK law now accepts that children are the direct victims of the abuse of their mothers. However, judges in Hague cases almost never accept that. Like one of the women in the video said, you cannot argue that putting children into a situation where their mothers are controlled, abused, jobless, isolated, homeless is in their best interests. But that is the exception, the norm, and not the exception. Actually, I also wanted to say, when you force mothers and children to go on the run because you won't protect them, you put them into an extremely vulnerable situation. They cannot live normal lives at all. This is Anita Guerra. So she was in the UK with the father's consent with her children. He filed a Hague case against her, nevertheless, which is not unusual. She lost and returned to the US with her children. She was in court in a custody case within 24 hours of landing in the USA and lost custody of her children. She has not seen her children for 8 years now. Like me, she was ordered by the family court to pay maintenance for the privilege of having an abusive man bring up her children. If she goes to America, she would risk being arrested. Jane's First Nations daughter was forced out of Australia back to her abusive father in Belgium, even though the court found that this would cause an intolerable situation for this child. This 3-year-old little girl has not seen her mother for 6 months now. This decision of the court was a violation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. All of these cases that you see involve abuses of the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child and other pieces of international law. But judges do not consider the international law is applicable, or the human rights law is applicable to family law cases. Bella, the Hague Convention was used preemptively to trap her, a British full-time mother, and her children in the USA by her wealthy ex-husband while they went through custody proceedings. The father now has sole legal and physical custody of the children. I believe that the Hague Convention is being used as a form of trafficking of mothers and children. The way that mothers and children are treated in the family courts in the USA is becoming more and more extreme. Not many people realize that there is an enormous problem with corruption in the US justice system. This is an issue that doesn't only affect family cases, and I believe that our courts in the UK and Europe are going the same way if we don't take action. This is a democracy issue which affects all of us. Anna is a US mother of 4 who relocated with her husband to Switzerland. He became violent and threatened to kill her. He returned to the USA and threatened to take custody of the children if she returns. She believed him. So she's been trapped with no help from the courts in Switzerland for 11 years. She is $1 million in debt because of all of the legal fees that she's been forced to pay, and because the US courts ordered that she must cover the private health insurance for herself and 4 children with no income. Anna believes that the lawyers and the judges who put her through this torment have enjoyed seeing her suffer. I believe Anna. This is Janelle. Her son lived with her in France. She was only in a casual relationship with his father, but nonetheless, she promoted her child's relationship with his father. But after a holiday in the UK, the British father filed a Hague case against her. She was arrested. Her child, who was, I believe, about 10 months old at the time, was taken from her. He was still breastfeeding. She was thrown into prison. She spent 3 days in prison crying her eyes out over being ripped apart from her child like that. A UK court gave custody of the child to the father. For 3 years, Janelle has only had 10 hours a week of supervised contact with her child in the UK. She's here, she is struggling to find work. And as an overseas citizen, she doesn't have access to legal aid. Her ex-husband, partner, however, is very wealthy and is able to hire a big firm of lawyers. Hazel, her ex-boyfriend, used the Hague Convention and UK court to seize the children from the United States, where she was on holiday with one of her children, and custody of both children. But her ex-partner is not the biological father. Their children were conceived by IVF from an anonymous donor. He had no parental responsibility. And one of the clauses of the Hague Convention is you must not only have parental responsibility, but you must also be exercising it. But she is now completely estranged from her children. One of them is reporting having gender dysphoria. This law firm, which you'll find online right now, is boasting publicly about being able to take children and give them to parents who are not men who are not the biological fathers. And the barrister who has this on his own webpage sits as a part-time High Court judge. Cassandra Hasanovic was stabbed to death by her ex-partner after a court ordered their return to the UK. She told the Australian court that her ex-husband had threatened to cut her up into little pieces and send her piece by piece to her family. It didn't take long after her return with her children to the UK for him to stab her in front of the children. So this is my case. I've been battling to protect my children for 7 years. My children were abducted by their father in 2016 and taken to Croatia from the UK. So this is the kind of case for which the Hague Convention was originally designed. I succeeded in securing an order for my children's return, but my ex-husband threatened that he would corrupt the courts. He is a former intelligence services official. He works as a civil servant today in Croatian public service, and his threats came to fruition. In the context of the collapse of the rule of law, my children and I found ourselves trapped, isolated, stalked, harassed. I had no income and no support, and we were completely unprotected by the law in Croatia. I managed to get out of Croatia with my children, and I came to the UK hoping that the courts here might protect us, but they didn't. My evidence of abusive behaviour, including the abduction of my children and the failure of the Croatian authorities to protect us, were ignored. I didn't know then that this is the rule and not the exception in UK family court cases. I later found out that the judge on my case isn't even a family lawyer, and he sits on a panel of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, but he violated our human and legal rights. My lawyers told me that I could not appeal. I later found out that this wasn't correct, but it was too late. So I made a financial claim against the judge, and this is what he responded. My complaint was about the failure of duty of care towards my children and negligence. He said a judge does not owe a common law duty of care to litigants. Well, I was talking about my children. So who actually does have a duty of care to the children? And also judges, he says, are entitled to immunity from suit. So who is accountable exactly? So we were forced, my children were sent back to Croatia. I continued fighting and campaigning, armed with more information I'd gained in the UK about what was going on. But I found that the judges do not care about the law or about evidence. And at the end of last year, I found myself in a court hearing with 6 people who were under investigation by the Croatian Office for Anti-Corruption and Organised Crime. None of them were removed from the case, and the judge believed them and ignored my evidence and my children's wishes. Also in the hearing, and this ties on very nicely from from Amy's speech, there were 2 expert witnesses, a psychiatrist and a psychologist, who specialise in parental alienation. Other mothers told me that they had victimised them as victims of domestic abuse. These expert witnesses accuse parents who report abuse as being manipulative, alienating, as being paranoid, or having personality disorders with absolutely no evidence to silence them and their children. And that is exactly what happened in my case. My children said very clearly and consistently that they want to return to live with me in England. And they told about a dozen professionals and could not understand why they were not listened to. And at the beginning of this year, the situation got really bad. My sons refused to go back to their father, and I could see that 7 years of this risked making them seriously ill. I had to stand up to the ludicrous court orders that I had been reporting for years were unlawful. And at the end of last year, after that hearing and the judgment, it emerged that that same court was embroiled in a massive child trafficking scandal. And the Croatian government refuses to investigate what happened to over 120 children brought from Democratic Republic of Congo for adoption into Croatia since 2016. International adoption of children from DR Congo is prohibited, and the journalists found evidence of shocking malpractice. So I was forced to take my children to Switzerland to protect us from inhuman treatment by their father and by the Croatian authorities. And what happened there was shocking. I was told that because we have British and Croatian citizenship, we have no right to asylum. The authorities disclosed our whereabouts to the authorities that we had fled from. The children were sent back to Croatia against their wishes and against the explicit advice of the Swiss lawyer appointed to represent them. This is a multiple violation of international law. A refugee is a person who flees from violence, persecution, threats to their physical integrity, and it should include psychological integrity because the severe stress impacts our physical health too. Those are our rights under the Geneva Convention. And in Europe, we also have the right to asylum under the Istanbul Convention. It has 2 articles that explicitly state that victims of gender-based violence must be protected under asylum law, but states are not implementing the Istanbul Convention. The rights of women are in a parlous state, and the courts are treating women like surrogates and children like the property of their father. My children were treated like objects, and we were all manhandled by the Swiss police as they unlawfully took my children before we even had a chance to appeal. We saw very clearly that mothers and children are not entitled to asylum because of the Hague Convention. And at that moment, we felt the jackboot of the patriarchy crushing our necks, helped by female judges. So, as the first speaker pointed out, in recent weeks, concerns about the family courts, including the Hague Convention, were raised at the UN Human Rights Council. And the Special Rapporteur for Violence Against Women has raised this as an international human rights issue with state-level responsibility. But who is going to hold the states to account? I believe this is a humanitarian crisis. There is nowhere for mothers and children who are victims of abuse to hide. So where does that leave us? My children are right now in Croatia against their will. They're asking me, Mum, are you going to appeal? As little as they can, because their father controls all of their conversations with me by phone. I am afraid to go to Croatia in case of being arrested or sectioned. My children wrote to me on Mother's Day. One of them says about me, she hasn't got any bad points except that grandma cooks better than her. That's my mother. And the good points are, I can't say them all because it would take me thousands of years. The best thing is hugs. My other son says, I really love my mum and I hope I can see her very soon, but I can't tell them when we can see each other. Their dad wants us to only see each other for 2 hours a week under supervision of the same Croatian social services who victimized me and failed all of us. He wants me to go back to the same court to fight for contact, and I will do neither of those things. The children's Swiss lawyer told the judges very clearly that my children cannot expect good life outcomes if they're forced to return to Croatia to live with their father. I feel powerless, but I'm not. I'm campaigning and I don't know yet what I will do, but I do know that I will find a way. Thank you for listening, and back to Ruth now.
Mothers like Nataly, who are absolute warriors, and in the worst cases and the worst circumstances, they just never give up. It's women like Nataly that got me involved in this whole campaign. So Hague Mothers was set up in response to Mother Stories. And we have one very simple aim, and that is to end the injustices created by the Hague Convention, particularly for mothers and children who are victims of abusive relationships. That aim, which is a pretty big one, can only be managed through the international sisterhood, and that's how we're working. So it's an entirely voluntary campaign. We have no funding, though we're supported by Phileas Charity, and everything we do is co-produced with about 90 women from across the world, and we're growing all the time. We also have 2 very nice chaps who advise us, but essentially 90 women on this campaign. So there are Hague mothers, lawyers, domestic violence professionals, academics, journalists, psychiatrists, counsellors, feminists, children's rights advocates, and many more. And the way it works is that we ask people what their skills are, what their knowledge is, and ask for their ideas about what action should we take, and that's what we do. And we're working in an unexpectedly positive context within that wider context, which is just horrendous. It's unexpectedly good because of Reem Al-Salem, who's been mentioned several times already today. She's the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And she recently wrote a paper that many of you will have come across called Custody, Violence Against Women and Violence Against Children. And that piece of reporting is very much focused on the family courts, but also on the Hague courts. And she said in the recommendations that the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of child abduction should be revised to better protect abused women and their children by allowing a stronger defence against return if there is family and domestic violence. And she also says that that needs to incorporate an understanding that a child's return may compel an abuse survivor to return to violence and harm, and that courts with jurisdiction under the convention be required to consider family and domestic violence when interpreting and applying its provision. Now, this seems self-evident to us, especially after hearing those stories, but to have somebody of her seniority and her understanding and her international stature coming out and saying directly that a child's return may compel an abuse survivor to return to violence is a really significant step for us, and one we're hoping to build on. So what are we actually doing? Well, in October, there's the 8th Hague Convention Special Commission meeting. They only happen every 6 years, and a group of people, mainly male, but not always, get together to talk about the Hague Convention and how it's working and to discuss any problems with it. It's a very conservative group of people who are not much inclined to consider problems, particularly for mothers. And what we're hoping to do is to influence them. So a number of things. Our international steering group have produced what will be an open statement, a position statement, basically, explaining what the problems are and what needs to be done. We're going to get signatures, we hope, from the sort of premier, the leading Hague experts from across the world, and that will be sent to the Special Commission members and made public. We've made the Hague information video that Nataly presented on, which you saw earlier. And this is very important because one of the big problems is that people don't know about the Hague. Once they know, they care, but there's very little awareness, even amongst the legal profession, and certainly not amongst mothers who are living abroad with their children. We're also trying to build an evidence base. The Hague courts don't collect data, or they only collect the most minimal data. So they don't know that it's a majority of people who are mothers who have these petitions brought against them, over 75%, as we said. They don't know how often domestic violence is alleged. They don't know whether that leads to a change in outcome. We think it doesn't. So when we go and complain, they just say this is anecdotal. So we're building statistical evidence, and also we're creating mother stories so that people really understand the absolute brutality that comes in the wake of the Hague Convention. We're also hoping, as part of that, to create a Mother's Voices publication, a beautifully designed, thoughtfully edited piece of emotion, I suppose. And we will print that, and we will send it to the Special Commission members, which include people from all over the world. And we'll also send it to major governments across the world. In fact, to anybody who we think could influence this. We also have set up, or at least Global Arc, who work in this arena, working with us and a number of other organisations who work with Hague survivors in New Zealand, in Australia, in the US, in Brazil, in India, and in Europe. We set up this Protect Hague Victims petition, asking for the Special Commission to really look into this carefully and to see the abuse that is being carried on towards mothers and their children by the convention. And when I looked yesterday, it was almost at 31,000 signatures. So it's doing really well. We'll keep it going until October, and then we'll send that and all that information to the Hague Special Commission. And also, as I said, it's a co-produced project. So what happens is that each country has a slightly different context for the Hague. So each country needs a slightly different set of priorities. So each country has its own group, which decides semi-autonomously what they will do and how they will work. So in Australia and New Zealand, we have the blessing of a new Attorney General who seems sincere about his desire to protect women in these circumstances. And so he has said that domestic violence, even if it's just alleged and not proven, can be considered. We want to change the wording from may be considered to must be considered. So it becomes an absolute starting point. If there's domestic violence alleged, then the whole consideration of the return in a Hague case ends. There's also legal aid provision set up now in Australia for mothers, which is great. But again, we're pushing to have domestic violence and trauma-informed legal aid. Because if you have a lawyer who doesn't understand about coercive control, for example, or doesn't understand the impact of domestic violence on a child, even if they're not directly involved, but simply witness it, then your lawyer is worse than useless. So that's another thing we're pushing for. And finally, we're pushing for the children's wishes to be fully considered. The Hague Convention was actually set up to protect children, and it clearly is not doing that. So listening to the children, as Nataly was saying in her story, listening to the children's wishes, and particularly their wishes to be loved and cared for by their primary carer, who is invariably the mother, that needs to be taken into account. We've got a team, small team, but it's building in the US, Canada, and Mexico. Some of the things they're involved in is they're surveying resources and organizations that are already out there, so we can start to make links. They're hoping to create a pro bono list of specialist lawyers. In America's got a real problem because whereas most countries have a Hague bench of lawyers, of judges who are at least specialists, they may not be good, but they're specialists. In the States, there are 17,000 judges at every level who can hear a Hague case. So generally speaking, you're being heard by somebody who has no understanding of the context. So we're trying to get specialist lawyers and then starting to train up judges as well. And also our new Mexican team, which is only 2 members so far, but going to grow, they are about to run a research project looking at children's rights in relation to the Hague, which will be really, really significant, that information. In the UK, sorry, I'll speed up. We're working with Brunel University Global Lives Research Centre, fabulous people. They've got a research assistant in place to look at case law and analyse it so that we find out 120 cases from 2020 to 2023, just published cases, to find out how many of those were mothers, how many times domestic violence was alleged. And one lawyer I spoke to said in her experience, she's a Hague lawyer specialist, she said it was 100%. So that's what we're expecting. They're also talking about setting up a research centre, which will have the Hague at its heart, but also look at family courts and look at parental alienation and the whole arena of abuse of mothers and children that goes on in our judicial system. We've got a parliamentary engagement strategy to try and get MPs involved and interested. We're building court support resources. There's some fantastic resources out there for family courts and really good organisations working in that arena. But of course, the Hague Court is like the family court on steroids. It's much quicker, it's summary, it happens before you even had time to take breath. And it's international, and often you have to produce paperwork in different languages, etc. So we need slightly different resources, but we're trying to do that. And then recently, we had a co-design workshop to create a UK action plan. And we looked at how could we support and safeguard mothers and children pre-flight, before they've even decided they need to cross international borders, pre-court, court, and also post-court, because that's the bit that nobody ever thinks about in the judiciary. They make the decision, and then what happens to the children and the mothers afterwards is of no concern to them. But of course, that's what really counts. So lots of ideas we came up with. Some of them were fairly straightforward, raising awareness. Some of them were more revolutionary in a way. We already have peer support groups for mothers, but there was a suggestion that children should have peer support groups as well that could be internationally connected. And then more ambitiously, that there should be a one-stop shop in every country that's signatory to the Hague to give support and resources, and they would link up with each other. So those are some of the things we're doing. But as I said earlier, our immediate and pressing priority is to try to influence the outcomes of the 8th special session of the Hague Conference. We won't get this chance for another 6 years. And so my last bit of the presentation is to ask for your help, your practical, immediate, active help. The first thing we would ask you to do is to sign the Protect Hague Victims petition. Not just sign it, because if you sign it, that's great, that's one more signature, but if you could sign it and share with everybody you can think of, yeah, friends, family, colleagues, lawyers, domestic violence people, whoever you can think of who might consider signing and sharing it to Protect Hague Victims, that would be fantastic. So that's that link. Secondly, we really, really need to raise awareness. As I said earlier, once people know about this, they care about it. We just need to let them know. So if you could possibly share the Time for Change video and get other people to share it further. If we can build up the number of people who've seen that, I think we'll build up involvement and engagement. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, that would also be deeply fantastic. We haven't been tweeting much because it's voluntary. We sort of just do what we can, as most of these grassroots organizations. But we are going to start to build that so that we are engaging with other groups and organizations who work in a similar field. So please follow us, please retweet. But also, if you're part of an organization that has some sort of linkage, whether with family courts, whether with violence against women, whether with children's rights, etc., please DM me, and then we can make those connections. If you'd like to have a Hague Mothers newsletter, which comes out every month, you can sign up for that on our homepage of our website, and do have a look around. There's some great resources there. If you think that you have some skills or some knowledge that might help, and if you have some time and space, I know how busy we all are, but if you think you'd like to help and like to join us, please email me. We have people from all over the world, and it's growing literally by the day. Some of the people who work with us, all they can do, and it's a big thing, is to follow us on Twitter and make sure they amplify our voices. Other people take part in our steering groups. Other people take on particular tasks like the court support resources. So there's lots of different levels at which you can be part of it. And last but absolutely not least, Nataly makes my heart beat faster. I have so much, her courage is just beyond belief. It moves me to tears. Please, she has a petition to try and get her boys home. If you could sign and share that as well, that would be really significant. We'd be really grateful for all of those things. Thank you very much for listening.